I think what the industry needs is they're looking for stability, they're looking for certainty, and I think until the market sees some stability and certainty, there's going to be some skittishness about wanting to invest.
Hello, welcome to episode 29 of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the only independent, nonpartisan national forum covering FDA. I want to always remind you, if you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go to fdawatch.net. It's free, and you will get notices whenever we add an episode. And that's very useful. You'll also get a link to our references, which you'll hear at the end of this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about pharmaceuticals and biologics. And let me first start out with some headlines. As we've all been following, the acting commissioner, Kyle Diamantas, recently posted on the FDA website what they call a strategic framework built around 4 public health priorities: maintaining U.S. leadership in biomedical innovation, strengthening national health security, expanding access to safe, effective, and more affordable medical products, building a healthier America. I'm not sure there's any radical new ideas in there, but it's an iteration of this acting commissioner, and he could be acting commissioner for the rest of the year, of where he's trying to bring the agency. Certainly, he's brought some less flamboyant stability to the agency. We'll hear from our guest today. I know they're going to want to comment on how Diamantas has been doing it. That document is on FDA's website, fda.gov, and I think everybody in the FDA field, should read it. It's not long, but it does present for the first time as acting commissioner how Kyle feels about things. From the Pharma desk, FDA recently made available more than a dozen complete response letters, CRLs. As you know, last April, a year ago, the agency announced that they were going to be releasing complete response letters. They discontinued it for a few months, and now they're back to doing it. And we're going to talk a little bit about CRLs and the implications for the release of that kind of data. From the device desk, FDA recently cleared what is believed to be the first software as a medical device. It incorporates a patient-facing large language model, which marks a significant milestone for the regulation of generative AI in healthcare. This is all according to an article from McGuire Woods, and the decision signals that the agency is prepared to evaluate large language-based clinical software under existing regulatory framework. So, something that we're going to be watching here. From the foods desk, FDA delayed publication of its proposed rule to eliminate the GRAS pathway for food ingredients until December. We recently spoke with Susan Main, who used to head up CFSAN at FDA, about the GRAS issue. As Susan explained, if they change the GRAS system, then it's going to add immeasurably to the time that FDA needs to review food additives and food ingredients. So we'll see how that proceeds. And then finally, from the cosmetics desk, the Personal Care Products Council is urging the U.S. Trade Representative to ensure that cosmetics and personal care products are prioritized in the proposed agreement, the U.S.-China Board of Trade. And PCPC said the industry's highly integrated global supply chains depend on predictable trade policies and access to key ingredients. So if you want to learn more about that, we're going to have a cosmetics episode coming up in just a few weeks. Let's meet our guests, 2 old friends, Dan Kracov. Dan's a partner at Arnold Porter. He's the chair of the firm's Global Life Sciences Industry Group. Dan has been on the first ever FDA Watch series that we had, which dealt with AI. Dan and I have been working together for decades, literally for decades. I can remember when he started his career. So Welcome back to FDA Watch, Dan, and it's always good to see you.
Good to see you.
Gayatri Rao, she has not been on FDA Watch. She's also an old friend. She just joined Hyman, Phelps McNamara, HPM, as a director. They just made the announcement a few weeks ago. She spent nearly a decade at FDA, including 7 as the director of the Office of Orphan Products Development. She was the face of the orphan products mandate at FDA for all of that time. Then she spent 8 years at Rocket Pharmaceuticals. So she's now back to practicing law, but she's also a medical doctor, MD, JD. So she brings enormous experience and insight into our podcast today. So good to see you again, Gayatri. We hadn't seen each other for several years, so it was good to reconnect just a few weeks ago.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Wayne.
So first question to you, Dan, and then Gayatri. I want to ask you about Operation TrialBlazer. And everybody's calling it Operation TrialBlazer because that's the easier way, I guess, to pronounce it. We've seen a lot of stories about it, but it actually is Operation TrialBlazer, as in clinical trials. It's a new initiative by the FDA. It involves expedited INDs. It involves facilitated communications between the industry and the FDA. It involves dealing with the single trial standard. So let me start with you, Dan, and get your reaction to Operation TrialBlazer.
Generally very positive in that it's really a compelling need that's been around for some time to kind of bring all these things together, these types of proposals and initiatives to really accelerate things. We're increasingly meeting competition in terms of the United States biotech industry around the world. And we got to up our game. And that includes from a regulatory perspective in terms of trying to find mechanisms and ways to get to the same place in terms of the IND standard and ultimately the NDA and BLA standard, but to do it faster and to do it more cheaply. I think a lot of its elements are incredibly important. Probably the most important is early stage CMC changes in terms of, I've seen a lot of companies get slowed down enormously by FDA's expectations around the early stage burden on CMC. There's also some new ideas here that haven't been announced before, like the use of qualified research institutions, including CROs and academic medical centers to accelerate first-in-human testing, basket trials, platform trials, master protocols. These are not new ideas, but to put them together, really focus on how do we make sure these things are being used is incredibly important. It's really just a start, but I think we need to go there or the current system is just not sustainable anymore.
Gayatri, your reaction to it?
I agree with Dan that I think it is a really good, necessary, and important start. It's also important to point out that this is a cross-agency initiative, all under HHS. So there are elements, for example, with FDA, NIH, et cetera. But kind of honing in on FDA specifically here, I agree with Dan. There is a focus on clarifying requirements for the IND. Things like CMC, as Dan pointed out. I think the devil is going to be in the details. They issued a web page. FDA started a web page where they tried to provide some specific applications of where folks might be working under the wrong assumption, where they think the bar is higher than it actually needs to be. So there's some really helpful information on the web page, but I do note that it looks like it's more CDER specific than it is for some of the biological products. And not surprisingly, it's also looking at how do we limit and make more fit for purpose, like the preclinical, non-clinical animal testing that's going to be required. This is something we've heard folks talking about a lot. So again, it'll be interesting to see how that gets implemented. And of course, everyone's interested in seeing how the expedited IND pilot actually gets kicked off. There is, of course, an RFI out that is soliciting comments about the expedited IND. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually gets implemented and whether it is able to actually accomplish the mission of expediting INDs.
Yeah. There's been so many changes in CDER and CBER this past year and a half, and we've all been watching. Gayatri, you were there for a long time. I just want to get your views as to what's going on. What is your view? I'm not going to say from the inside because none of us are on the inside anymore, but I'm going to start with you, Gayatri. What's your impression as to what's going on in CDER and in CBER? And look at it almost from the employee standpoint, not just from the outsider. And I know that in the last almost a decade now, you've been on the outside developing products. So you've got both perspectives.
Mm-hmm. I really marvel at the commitment and the dedication of the career folks at the agency for continuing to do the really important work of the agency, despite a lot of changes that have happened over the course of 18 months. I mean, of course, with every change in administration, you do see change in leadership. But there has been just an unusual amount of change. And while there's been a lot of discussion about, who's going to be the new FDA commissioner, a lot of the work is really done at the center level and at the reviewer level. And, just from my perspective, certainly, there's acting directors at both CDER and CBER. And they've certainly tried to bring some stability to the centers, which I think is good. I will note that within CDER, in the review divisions itself, there seems to be more stability, business as usual to some extent within CDER. I think we've seen a lot more change, and there's still more uncertainty on the CBER side than on the CDER side, where now there is an acting director at CBER, who, of course, is trying to bring stability. But underneath that, even the head of OTP, the Office of Therapeutic Products, this is the super office that oversees like gene and cell therapies, for example. There is no one in that role right now, and so the acting CBER director is also serving as the acting OTP director as well. So there's some uncertainty. And then I think the question is going to be when they name the permanent directors. I think there's a question as to whether there's going to be yet more change in terms of direction, policy, priorities.
Dan, same question from your perch. You've been watching this for many decades. CDER, CBER, we've seen a lot of change. Your impression?
I agree with Gayatri in terms of the chaos that's occurred. We've had 5 acting or actual CBER directors and 6 CDER directors in a relatively short period of time. We have some people in place now that are a lot more typical in terms of what we've seen in the past, and some folks who are in place now that seem to be seeking a reset, a regular order at least, a type of tenor to FDA. I just worry, is it going to last past the midterm elections? Because, RFK Jr., Secretary, has his views of the world. They were, quite active in implementing those views through the prior commissioner and head of CBER and others. we could easily go back to a state of chaos. And I think it's really important that they at least recognize that there's a political liability to allowing FDA to lose its authority and really put FDA in the public eye. I mean, I don't think they really understood how long it took to build that, literally, 100 years and or more. A lot of it was really fundamentally undermined. So I'm really hopeful that it's going to be a true reset and will be maintained as something that will be, the FDA we've all admired over the years. Unfortunately, I think it's very difficult. There's been a lot of political involvement at FDA, certainly much more so than in the past. Very serious conflicts of interest, advisory committee conflicts of interest and leadership conflicts of interest. Very strange, attacks on particular products or classes of products, but while promoting other products. A lot of work on behalf of trial lawyers and others. I think it's going to be very, very difficult for them to maintain that. They're also trying to delve into areas that FDA has traditionally not had a role, doesn't have a statutory role, really, like affordability, as if FDA didn't have enough to contend with. So I'm in a wait-and-see mode. I'm hopeful. The user fee reauthorization seemed to be moving along. That was threatened at one point, but there's a lot of curveballs. I mean, there's going to be a decision on mifepristone, for example, and that could, really take us back in terms of the perception of the agency. So we will see. I'm in a wait-and-see mode, Wayne.
Yeah. So I just want to follow up. How are you advising your clients? If I'm a client of yours, and I say, the political uncertainty. How should I be thinking about it as a drug or a device company, or is anybody in the FDA world these days?
Well, I mean, we advise clients to, one, be cautious, not to, think that what you hear today is going to be the same tomorrow, and try to backstop things in writing for the future. To try to take advantage of some of the openings that are occurring, the benefits that are occurring. But, as in the past, in general, there's still no magic wand that if we only get the person who can speak to, Secretary Kennedy, we can turn this around. And, there has been some of that in this administration. But at the end of the day, bad decisions can get struck down in court, and you can't rely upon simply back channeling or politics to help you all of the time. You really got to put the science on the record and be prepared to make your case, and if necessary, to drive it up within the agency and even to HHS. So it's a bit more confrontational than it has been in the past, I would say, because some of the stuff that's been done is, and the lack of consistency across review divisions, the lack of adherence to precedent in thinking about things, has been caused a lot of chaos, and you got to fight back, or we'll be living in a chaotic world going forward, where every decision's a new decision. As in other areas, and I'm really hoping that things will calm down, and we won't have to advise clients to, and how to navigate personalities only, as opposed to the issues.
Yeah, my thinking has changed a lot. I used to always advise clients not to escalate outside of FDA, sometimes not even to escalate within FDA above the center level on certain issues. That's obviously changed because decisions, as you pointed out, Dan, are being made above the FDA level at HHS, sometimes even in the White House. And it's unclear what role Congress is playing anymore these days at FDA. So it certainly is much more complicated than it than it used to be. And I think the point you make about personalities is a really important one. This is a very personality-dependent administration. I want to shift gears for a second and go, Gayatri, to one inevitable question for you always is what's going on with orphan drugs. You spent a good part of your career dealing with orphan drugs. As I said in introducing you, you were the face of the orphan drug program at FDA for 7 years. Your impression as to how the agency is now handling orphan drugs?
When I first started working on orphan drugs, I was told, listen, once you get into this, you're never going to want to leave. And that certainly proved true for me in my career. It's incredibly compelling and fulfilling work. In terms of what I'm seeing with respect to rare disease product development, I think there continues to be a real focus on orphan product development, kind of writ large. I think that's still there. Certainly, with respect to the reauthorization of the Rare Pediatric Disease Priority Review Voucher Program, that's been very helpful and a really important incentive for the biotech community. I think orphans in particular are, and we've seen this in trade press, they do seem to be very much in the crosshairs of some of the controversy that is happening with the agency, because often rare disease development is where you need to see flexibility, right? And that's where there will always be some disagreement regarding how much flexibility, how much data is enough data, what does risk tolerance look like? And so I think often a lot of these controversies and disagreements that you're seeing played out in the trade press often does involve rare diseases because it gets at these very fundamental questions. But Wayne, if I could just take the liberty of circling back to your question earlier about, what would you advise clients, particularly even in the rare disease space, I still think, stick to the science, focus on the science, do your due diligence, work in good faith with the review division, and think carefully about when you want to escalate. You can't escalate everything. So be very thoughtful about when and how you escalate. Because remember, after you escalate, often it's going to get, it's going to be shifted down back to the review division to make the decision. So you have to weigh that carefully. Having said that, there is definitely reason to escalate. So I'm not suggesting that folks shouldn't, but be very kind of thoughtful about when and how.
Yeah. I want to ask you one other question about a different topic, cell and gene therapy. I know you've been involved in that, and want to ask you and then turn to Dan for the same question. What do you see going on there? Is the agency, we've been talking for years about whether the agency has the staff, has the capacity to oversee cell and gene therapy. It's obviously, in many ways, the future of medicine. Again, I'm just going to keep a question general. What's your impression, Gayatri? And then same question for Dan.
I've seen firsthand in my time at biotech just how incredible the science has been in terms of the development of gene therapies. I've had the privilege of having a front row seat to that. So the science is remarkable, and the science is often outpacing the regulatory framework that's there to regulate these therapies. It's not that the framework isn't adequate, it's that how do you apply that framework appropriately to these therapies, and often it's to these therapies in a rare population. And so especially in the last 18 months, there has been a little bit of whiplash in terms of decisions that have been made in CBER. situations where CRLs were issued, where they were viewed as a surprise. Companies were expecting to go in, expecting approval, and then ultimately getting a CRL. What's also interesting now, though, is where we were seeing advisory committee meetings kind of taking very much a backseat, where there hasn't been a lot of AdCom work. There is now, two advisory committee meetings on the books for cell and gene therapy products. So I think it's really where a lot of the action is. But I think what the industry needs is they're looking for stability. They're looking for certainty. And I think until the market sees some stability and certainty, there's going to be some skittishness about wanting to invest in this area.
Dan?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Gayatri just said, but I would say, it's one of the hardest hit areas by the chaos that's occurred over the last, year in particular. And it's a complex area. The manufacturing is complex. There are safety issues that need to be carefully dealt with, assays that need to be dealt with, et cetera. And, I think it really was a setback for a while. I do think that we're getting back on track as part of the reset. I will say that what I did like about what they were talking about, at least with plausible mechanism and so forth, is you have to have the infrastructure in place. And Dr. Marks used to talk about this as well in terms of the need to do that. And they're starting to put guidance documents out that help build an efficient infrastructure for not just large-scale gene and cell therapy, but also the N of 1 cases. And that's what you need. It could have been started earlier. It could have been done in a more organized way, but here we are. And now, I think that should be the focus. This should be a national priority. It's the future of medicine. I say to people constantly, we're still in the early days. And there's so much more that could be done here. And it's going to take the next decade to build this out. And that's just the United States, much less globally. And we got to bring the cost down. There's only so many people in this world that can be treated at, a couple $1 million treatment. And so it's a hard area, but one that's worth doing. Obviously, the science is just so incredible that I'm glad we've turned the corner, but we lost some time, I think.
Yeah. When you say turn the corner, are we back on track? Does it appear like
like anything else in the administration, it's a wait and see type of thing. It's I was saying reset earlier, but at the same time, under the surface, there's still things going on that look a lot like the prior to this reset FDA vaccines, most importantly. I mean, there's still a very active effort to undermine the vaccine enterprise in this country that's going on with really shoddy science. I mean, just to be honest, and that's happening. And we got to bear that in mind. That's going to bubble up at some point, and we're going to have to deal with that again. We could lose ground here again as well, gene and cell therapy. It's these are very serious topics that require sustained focus and not just doing what you think is the right thing to do, but really bringing everyone along and getting the experts on board and so forth. And I think a lot of that hasn't occurred.
If I could just add, I agree with what Dan's been saying, and I'm glad he brought up the plausible mechanism framework, because that has the potential to really help move the development of these N of 1 therapies or therapies for very, very small populations. And it's very tailor-made for, genetic diseases, right? That the whole framework. I think what's going to be interesting to see is how does that framework actually gets how does that actually get implemented? There's a lot of questions that we're getting about, well, we're working on X therapy, how can we use this plausible mechanism framework? Does it apply to us? How does it apply? So I think there's really there's going to be a lot of interest in terms of how does that actually get implemented. Similarly, on the CMC side that Dan brought up, I agree. There's been a lot of talk about flexibility for CMC, but again, manufacturing in the gene and cell therapy space is very different, very complicated, very expensive. And how do you actually implement those flexibilities in a way that's not just one-offs, but can be more streamlined across the industry?
We're going to take a quick break now. Very interesting discussion. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with Dan Kracov, Arnold Porter, Gayatri Rao of Hyman, Phelps McNamara. You haven't been introduced that many times that way, Gayatri, so you're going to have to get used to being introduced that way. We'll be right back with Dan and Gayatri. And we're back talking about pharmaceuticals and biologics at the FDA. Question on a global level, Dan. I know you've been quoted a lot as talking about what's going on in China and the need for the U.S. to maintain a competitive posture. What's your view as to what's going on now, and especially what's happened in the last 18 months with this new administration?
Well, in a way, this is less about the administration, because I think any administration in China is a bipartisan issue in many, many respects, and any administration would have to respond to the rise of biotech in China. I mean, they have come an amazingly long way in a relatively short period of time. I mean, I dealt with the heparin crisis in 2008 and was very deeply involved in all of those investigations and so forth. And, it was a pretty rudimentary industry at that time. And now it's world class. And I think the next step for China is going to be to try to extend their reach beyond simply licensing out to global pharmaceutical and biotech companies. They certainly have the capabilities, and everyone seemed to realize that at once. And I think a lot of that work has been done by the China Select Committee in Congress, which is a bipartisan committee that first focused on the biosecure legislation, at least in the life sciences area. And that legislation basically identifies those, in very simple terms, identifies those Chinese companies that may be affiliated with the Chinese government, the Communist Party, the PLA, etc. And then if they're listed as such, companies are over time, there's a grandfathering period, but over time they need to delink from those companies if they want to have contracts and grants with the United States government. So we've seen that play out, but the most recent development that really focused the mind of the industry, which has been going over to China and licensing monoclonal antibodies and so forth, bring them to the United States, is what was called the BINZA amendments to the COINS Act, classic Washington speak. But what it means is legislation that would essentially create a onerous review process requirement for deals with Chinese companies, at least certain Chinese companies. And we're also seeing America First provisions and Operation TrialBlazer. All of those are centered around this issue: is how do we compete? Again, it's very bipartisan. There's much more to come on that. And this competition is here to stay globally for the U.S. industry. It's really amazing to me. When I first started practicing, there were 3 biotech products total. And now there's obviously thousands of biotech products around the world, and we're worried about competition from China. I mean, what a journey in the very, very short period of time, really, 40 years.
I want to ask you after the same question, but Dan, I see you've got your crystal ball out there, and I want to ask you how you see that evolving in terms of the relationship between China, the U.S., and the rest of the world in drug development, in manufacturing, in source materials. Where are we headed on that? Gayatri, I'm going to ask you the same question.
I think we're already seeing much more caution by U.S. companies in terms of their dealings with particular Chinese entities. I think at the end of the day, the BINZA legislation is unlikely to be enacted in the form that it was introduced, just because the notion that we're going to cut ourselves off entirely from China and deny U.S. patients, the fruits of potential Chinese innovation is not in anyone's interest, frankly. So I think it's going to be much more industrial policy, frankly, in terms of supporting the U.S. industry, or it should be, I should say. There's an aversion to industrial policy in this country, but this is crying out for it. And we should rethink everything. We should be thinking about tax benefits and credits, R&D, credits. Are there exclusivities that could be put in place? Are there, what do we need? Do we need to fix our patent system? Otherwise, these controls are going to develop in a lot of different spaces, and we're going to turn up. At the end of the day, it's going to be so hard to operate that we'll just abandon, trying to operate with China. Anything China is very difficult to predict right now. There's so many issues between the U.S. and China that any one of which could take things off the rails again. So we will see. We will see. The world has changed. We got to realize what's happened.
Gayatri?
I just don't think, time is really on our side here. I think there's been a lot of efforts, especially more recently, to focus on this issue. And I think that's very much a positive step. But things are moving quickly on the China side. I mean, it's pretty commonplace now to see, companies in license phase 1 data from an investigator-initiated trial in China, get that data, bring it to FDA, and kind of leapfrog over this phase 1 portion and get straight to phase 2 and or pivotal stage. And so there's a real advantage there. So whatever is being done needs to be done with a sense of urgency.
Again, let me shift gears here. OMB just announced that they're going to propose a regulation that will bring us back to pre-1997 days on advertising, which would essentially mean that, in effect, DTC television advertising as we know it today would not exist, because the amount of risk disclosure, safety information would be so much that it just doesn't make it practical. And their intention, and they announced it last September 9th, the president announced it, their intention is to reduce significantly, if not eliminate, DTC advertising without using the word ban, because if you use the word ban, then you automatically go, that just winds you up in court the next minute on the First Amendment issues. So Dan, let me ask you overall, how real is that, and what are you advising your clients to do today in August of 2026? What are you advising your clients to do today with regard to that announcement? And Gayatri, you're going to have the same questions of your clients as you develop your practice at Hyman Phelps.
Yeah, I advise clients to fight it in a smart way. I think there are plenty of tools to fight it. We both remember, Wayne, when they were scrolling the PI at late night on cable TV back in the day. We're not going back to that, and the First Amendment case law, we've litigated a lot of that over the years, has only grown stronger in this space. And so is the technology. I mean, the concern back with adequate provision was, you can't get the full label. How's the patient going to get the full label? But these days, everyone's got a phone. You have QR codes. And, if you want the pharma company to read the label to you, you get on their QR code, you could figure out a way, they could have a way to read it to you, like they used to do that as well back in those days. So the notion, part of this First Amendment test is, are there other alternatives you can use other than limiting speech? And to me, we're in a much better place in terms of those alternatives being available. So I think this is going to be a failed effort. I think it'll either never go anywhere or it'll get struck down in court if they go too far. If it's things on the edges, like a QR code option or something like that, I think that's very doable. But I think what they're really doing right now that's much more impactful, at least in the short term, is all these untitled letters going out, because they put out guidance over time. There were a lot of things in the interstices of those guidance. And now companies are getting letters providing essentially, you can't use a single arm trial to do this, post hoc analysis and make a claim. Well, it wasn't clear necessarily from the guidance, and, it required that kind of effort. In enforcement, that's one of the roles that enforcement plays, is teaching the community on what is FDA's perspective more broadly. So I think they're going to continue to focus on that.
By that, you mean the untitled?
Enforcement on a case-by-case basis. And, I think it's a very difficult place for them to make policy in terms of limiting speech. I mean, whatever you don't like about DTC, and certainly folks like Macari hated DTC. He's always talking about all these people singing and dancing. But the root of it is doctors don't like people coming in their office and saying, I want dibubbleomuctase. I saw it on TV, right? And that's what this is really about. It's a balance of power between the patient and the physician. And we can make it better, but banning speech just doesn't work in this day and age. And I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
Gayatri, any comments on that?
It also doesn't seem to, really account for the fact that AI is an ever-present feature in everyday life, right? So today, are patients really going to see an ad and say, okay, just based on this ad alone, I'm going to go to my doctor and ask for this? No, more than likely, they're going to go to ChatGPT and learn more about this. So I'm with Dan in the sense that I'm watching what's happening. I do think it's going to be an uphill battle to really change markedly in terms of what's being done. But in terms of, advising clients, I think it's still appropriate to proceed as is, but come up with kind of a plan B and a plan C for if there are issues with your original option.
Okay. Great conversation. On that note, I'm going to turn briefly to our resource link segment. This is a segment that provides our subscribers with some valuable links that they may want to check out. You go to fdawatch.net. Here's a link that covers multiple focus areas. FDA has launched a new adverse event monitoring system. It's a unified, searchable platform, consolidates adverse reactions across biologics, vaccines, drugs, cosmetics, and other regulated products into a single dashboard. Should be much more convenient. Our link at fdawatch.net takes you to FDA's page with more information and with access to the system. Our Pharma resource link for this episode FDA recently proposed a rule intended to modernize drug manufacturing registration. This got a lot of publicity. The rule proposes streamlining requirements for distributed manufacturing networks and expanding registration requirements for certain foreign drug manufacturing facilities. Again, go to FDAWatch.net and you can get a link to FDA's press release announcing the proposed rule. And from there, you can click into the rule itself in the Federal Register. From our devices desk, a new study published in Curious, Cureus, found that although FDA's authorization of AI and machine learning enabled medical devices has grown rapidly, these devices remain heavily concentrated in radiology and some other image-based specialties. And the authors of this article said that broader investment in data infrastructure, regulatory pathways, and clinical development is needed to expand AI adoption across underserved areas of medicine. This is really a piece that's worth reading. So again, come to FDAWatch.net and you can get a link to it. Our foods link, the acting Deputy Commissioner for Human Foods, Don Prater, said that developing a definition for ultra-processed foods remains a priority, but acknowledged the effort is very, very challenging. We just talked with Susan Main, as I mentioned before, about this on an episode that was just posted. Don Prater said the science is still evolving and multiple definitions are currently in use. This has been a very, very public issue. What is an ultra-processed food? It's going to affect many, many things, including nutrition labeling. So our link takes you to an article which includes Prater's statements and some additional analysis of this ongoing push to define ultra-processed foods. Finally, our cosmetics link. There was a recent op-ed in a publication called Cosmetics Business, and it discusses FDA's upcoming review of several peptides. I wish we had the time with Gayatri and with Dan to get into peptides, but this article deals with peptides, and it deals with the significant implications for the beauty industry, for the cosmetics industry, particularly for skincare products that rely on peptide ingredients. Peptides will continue to be an issue for some time now. An article worth reading because it links peptides not just to other products, non-cosmetics, but to the beauty industry itself. Again, go to FDAWatch.net. On that note, I want to thank Dan and Gayatri for being such great guests. We'll have them both back. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Evan Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister, and definitely check out our website, FDAWatch.net. So as I say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines.